Welcome back to Flyers Nitty Gritty fans, to Getting Gritty with It with your host, Yariv, Wolok, my partner in crime, Vasili Gianarakos. Vasili, welcome back for another episode, my friend.
Doing good, Yariv. It should be a fun one. I mean, we got a great guest on this week and lots to dive into. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well, man. You're right. You're absolutely right. We do have a great guest, and I think it came right on time from NHL.com, covers the Flyers, Hockey Buzz, and obviously you should know him, author and everything else. Bill Meltzer. Bill, welcome back to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get right into it because we actually have a lot to talk about, and there's been a lot, and it's not just games. Obviously, there's changes a brewing, and maybe the biggest change that we've seen here in several years. And it's an exciting time, but also kind of a weird time. So let's just start off. The Flyers are coming off of two losses. A loss to the Penguins, a game that I would say they were relatively in until the third period, where the game kind of got away from them, and they lose that game handedly. But then a Knights game where they lose to Vegas in another close game, but one that again they kind of let the score get away from them. They had some pressure in between, some battle back in between, but ultimately fall short. The nice thing about that game is at least they scored a little bit of goals, which has not come easy of late. They have 4 goals in the last 2 games, so not too impressive. Bill, I'll go straight to you. Your thoughts on the recent losses and kind of what you've seen out of the Flyers.
Well, they're at a point right now where scoring, to put it mildly, scoring has been a big issue since the All-Star break. The scoring just dropped off a cliff at about 1.7 a game. I mean, there are many different ways you could break that down. To me, this is a big piece of it, and I've never seen this after this big of a stretch. The Flyers are actually a net negative on their own power plays since the All-Star break. Meaning they've scored 3 power play goals and they've allowed 4 shorthanded goals. So
did not know that. That's definitely an interesting stat.
Though not that surprising.
No, I mean their power play's been very bad last season, and it's kind of continued. Though it's improved by the numbers, technically it's still the worst in the league. So slight incremental improvement, but obviously still the worst isn't great. Though, I mean, last night against Vegas, they did have a couple good looks with Tippett, Forster, and D'Angelo up top. I mean, they had Frost and Hayes with a couple looks as well on an earlier one, but they did have puck movement, but they just, like you're saying, Bill, they can't really score. And they're not really finishing the chances that they do create. Like you do see plays get created specifically by like a Tippett and Frost mainly. I mean, Farabee, you could throw him in there as well. He's had a ton of chances, but they just can't seem to score on a consistent basis, really, right? But it is good that you're seeing chances get created, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, to break down the power play, right? They have. If they don't win the first face-off, they're in trouble because they have a lot of problems with entries. And Flyers, of course, are not a good face-off team either. Flyers are at the bottom of the league in face-offs. But if they can win that first draw and generate some puck movement, that's where a lot of times they've scored fairly early in some of those power plays. I would say they've improved minimally on entries. It got a little bit better, but it's liable to blow up again in their faces at any time. I mean, entries are still an issue. When they get good puck movement, when they're actually in and set up, a lot of times they don't get the puck to really the great scoring areas. Nobody seems to get open, and then when they do actually get something to net and there's a chance, they don't finish them. In last night's game, Tyson Foerster had his first NHL goal on his stick. It was actually a chance created by Tippett, and the rebound goes right to him, point blank, and he puts it out the post. And that's just, that's going to happen. That's going to happen to every player sometimes. It's just the Flyers just have a devil of a time putting the puck in the net when they have a look like that and a point blank kind of chance. So, you know, that's been a big piece of it, is that the power play just gives them nothing. And it gets harder as you get deep into the year to score 5-on-5. Um, the other part of it too, I mean, the Flyers had it was literally a month. It was December 17th until or maybe December 14th until January 14th. And over that stretch, the Flyers averaged 3.7 goals a game. That was the oasis of in the desert there, because
Yeah, their highest of the year.
yeah, and the Flyers were winning some games in there, and actually over that stretch, the Flyers were tied with Tampa for the rate they were scoring, and usually they were going to keep that up. They're not a 3.7 goal a game team, but at least there was some hope that, okay, they're trending the right way. And then really, really, it kind of started with the 2-1 home loss to Chicago, when Chicago ended their long regular season losing streak in Philadelphia. Flyers got that early Frost goal with that kind of ankle breaker move on Seth Jones. It looked like they were well set up, have another big offensive game, and just they're never in sync in that game. And it's up to the players. I'm not blaming Torts here, but I'm just pointing this out, that after that game, Torts said, well, for a few weeks there, we kind of fooled ourselves into thinking we were a team that can score off the rush. We're a team that needs to grind. Um, the problem is that as a grinding team, the Flyers can't score. They're not a team that's going to score out the rush either, but they can score out the rush a little bit sometimes. They have some guys that can do it. I wouldn't say a ton of guys that can do it. But since the All-Star break, other than that little stretch where Konechny broke out of his slump and was getting hot again, and then he got hurt in Calgary, it's been so hard to score, and that gives you no margin for error. So they've had games where in March, I think in March they've been more competitive in games. February was an ugly month. There were too many non-competitive games in February. That to me was a big disappointment. You're not really looking for wins right now. It doesn't matter. They're not making the playoffs, but you want to see them compete. You want to see them hang in games. So they've been doing that. I actually thought in the Vegas game, very resilient, very evenly played game. Actually, it just came down to the fact that the Flyers' penalty kills kind of sprung a leak since the All-Star break too. But the March games have generally been better. At this point, you're looking for anything positive you can take out of the rest of this year. So that's kind of where they're at.
Yeah, and I would say they definitely lost some of that discipline that they had, especially in that stretch what you were talking about. They also weren't taking a lot of penalties. All of a sudden, there's undisciplined penalties, there's suspensions. Farabee's got a retaliation in there. And I think that's probably spurred on more problems for a team that already struggles to score. I do want to stick back on the power play. I think back to something that Chuck Fletcher said while he was GM here. This was last season when he was talking about the power play struggles. He said, "Oh, well, we don't have the right type of players to succeed on a power play." And this was after the trades that he made, bringing in Atkinson and, a slew of other trades. And I just wonder, I think this team used to have kind of that power play talent. Obviously, with Claude Giroux here, Jake Voracek, there's a whole different element on the power play. But do you think that's really what this team is missing on the power play? Or do you think that they should be squeezing a little bit more out of it? Because on one hand, I go, obviously they need that real play driver, a guy like Frost. Maybe it's 5 years in a senior that, has put up 80 points in the league. That's how you get to that middle of the road, a collection of a few of those guys who can really move the puck. But just to be at the very bottom of the league, do you think it's the injuries that have caused this? Like, do you see a healthy Flyers, even just with the current roster, doing better at some point next year? If I'm assuming.
Yeah, I would say marginally, honestly. I mean, like when Giroux was here, and Giroux has been one of the NHL's best power play guys for well over a decade.
Yeah,
He still couldn't score in the power play.
Yeah,
it's true. They weren't doing that well.
Yeah. And when Atkinson was healthy, he was getting some power play goals, but they were still struggling, and it's been a multi-year thing too. Even really since the 2021 season. It's really been 3 straight years where the power play just trended down, um, and they've tried some things at times that seemed to temporarily work. Like for a while, they had a double net front setup that actually they had a little bit of success with. Um, you know, so I mean, I remember Chuck Fletcher talked about the need for a flank shooter, and they still have that. Although honestly, I mean, a guy that's a pretty good power play flank shooter when he's healthy is Wade Allison. They never use him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that.
You got to get the puck to him in the first place. I mean, Forster, Forster's a good flank shooter too. Very good one timer guy. So it helps, but you have to actually get in, get set up, and get the puck to him.
Yeah, get the puck on net too. That's the big
get
thing.
get it on the net. That's another issue too. D'Angelo's pretty good at getting pucks on net, but you got to have the guy there to bang in the rebounds, and
Yeah.
they don't have that net front presence
Or provide a screen, which I mean they're trying to
Yeah.
do with Ristolainen, obviously. I think what it is at least for modern day NHL in terms of the power play, right? It's all about quick puck movement, things like that. A lot of the times they're just too stationary. They kind of play it out for teams. They can anticipate what they're going to do, and then they kind of break the plays down. That and the entries, as you mentioned as well, Bill, right? Those are kind of the killers for them. And I think, like you were saying too, Yariv, I mean, when you insert guys that are more high end play drivers, more high end skilled players, obviously they're going to be able to control the puck more and control those situations better on the power play. That's kind of what they're missing and probably hoping to add through the draft, maybe with a high pick that they get here, or even a guy like Gauthier eventually in the future, potentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, let's stick on to add to that point. Let's stick on one guy that you already brought up. A guy who's getting his first real taste. Tyson Forrester. This is a guy who, personally, in my opinion, I think we're getting a good taste. I think we see a sample size of what he's capable of. Still, would much prefer to see him finish the season in the AHL. I don't think he's 100% quite ready, but you obviously flashes of what he has there, what's in store. I mean, I'm not going to say this is the type of player he is, but we're talking about the power play. I think about John LeClaire, guy with a lot of size, a big shot, really good around the net. I think Tyson Forrester can bring a skill set like that. Again, I'm not going to put a LeClaire onus on him, but just a guy like that we kind of need with a big shot, big frame, can fight for pucks, and he seems to be pretty strong, pretty resilient, and maybe even pretty good two-way, which means he'll fill in with Torts pretty well. Bill, what do you think about Forrester, at least what you've seen so far, and how about his readiness to be realistic and maybe a middle six forward on this team next year?
Yeah, I think that's a realistic target. He's never going to be a speedster. He's worked a lot on his skating, and it's gone from a concern as to whether he's going to have an NHL career because of it to where he'll be okay. He gets from point A to point B. He's a pretty smart player, so he'll find a way there. He's not gonna get involved at the NHL level in a ton of transition plays unless he's trailing it or somebody sets him up trailing a play for his big shot. Goal scoring wise, he has very good hands. One thing I've seen with him with the Phantoms, a little streaky. I mean, goal scorers tend to be streaky, but he scored in bunches, and then he's had pretty long droughts where pucks aren't going in. I think he's underrated as a distributor. I think he sees the ice actually pretty well. So if you focus too much on him, he'll find somebody who's open. I think that's a nice aspect to his game. He didn't necessarily have the reputation in junior hockey as a 200-foot guy. I think he's worked really hard at it, and you saw in his NHL debut, he was getting back and back check, on the back check, blocked a few shots for the team. So he's really worked hard on that aspect, and it's paying dividends. I don't see him as being a guy who's going to get you 35 plus goals a year every year. I think he'd be a pretty bankable 20 to 20, 22, 24 guy, in the relatively near future. So that's, I mean, I think he has a good career ahead of him. I mean, as long as he keep the expectations realistic, and I do think a middle six forward with some power play time, that's kind of where I see him at.
So you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. So with Forster, I mean, I haven't had the chance to really watch him too much with the Phantoms this season, but just from what I've seen with the preseason stuff and through the Flyers games, that the little tastes he's had here, he does look like he is kind of close to making that extra jump to the NHL level. Most likely next season, as you guys were kind of alluding to, probably in that middle six area. Just with his skill set, I mean, for me, it looks like he kind of has a knack to get to those open areas and kind of sniff around the net a bit and just find areas and soft places of the ice where he can kind of use his shot. So that definitely seems like there's smarts to his game, and that kind of makes up for maybe the lack of speed and things that he's kind of lost on with the skating and losing that off and kind of that with just his minimal prowess there. But I would say in terms of like the ceiling, like you guys were saying, probably around that area, right? Like a 25, 30 goal guy perennially and things like that. So obviously there's upside with Forster, and it's more just about letting him develop his game. I think for him right now, it's probably best go back down with the Phantoms, have a good playoff run with them, and see where it goes from there probably next season.
Yeah, he seems like a complimentary guy, like a guy that if you put him in the right position, maybe he's a 30 goal scorer. If he has a record type of year, like a Scott Hartnell type of guy who put up a bunch of goals, who wasn't necessarily like a perennial goal scorer, but you threw him with Claude Giroux and he had a big shot. He could get, could work around the net. I'm not saying he is Scott Hartnell, but he is a guy. I think you put him in the right position, he can succeed offensively for sure. Another guy that, and I'll shout out to you, Vasili, for having this stat here: 26 shots in his last 5 games, however, no goals. Owen Tippett. Let's be honest. I mean, he's being used like he is the Flyers' best player right now, as far as we can see with the injuries. Offensively, he definitely is. You pretty much look at this team, and the best players up front have been Tippett and Cates, which really are the youngest guys. And then Frost having some, really nice season. That's the good thing about this season, regardless what everybody says, is that these guys have been led by some kids, which is really nice. Not enough, but, still a good sign. But Owen Tippett, Bill, how do you feel about him? And do you feel, and this is something I brought up on this podcast, I look back at the Jake Voracek trade, right, where he came over here. He was under a point per game player. He wasn't necessarily fully developed, also a former top 10 pick. Around this age, right around 23, 24, 25, it's when a lot of these guys start getting it together. Do you see an opportunity here where Tippett potentially can make that large jump next season, where maybe we see a consistent 30-goal guy, maybe even a 70-point player in the NHL, a guy who can, play top line or at least top six and be reliable beyond just 20 goals?
I think he has yet to show that, honestly. I love a lot of parts of his game. He's a big guy who can really skate. He's got a lot of moves. He's good one-on-one, very good at breaking guys down one-on-one. Has a heavy shot. Actually, he's pretty good using defensemen as a screen and firing pucks on net. Sometimes his best plays are where he doesn't have time to think about where he wants to put the puck. He just fires it. I'd like to see him just fire it more, because when he tries to pick corners, he tends to miss the net, honestly. Um, you know, there's so many things I like about Owen Tippett's collection of physical tools. But for all we talk about Tippett and all the time he's been racking up 22, 24 minutes a night, one game 27 minutes.
Yeah.
You look over the last 41 games, that's half a season. For all Tippett gets talked up and some talk Frost down, Frost has outscored him. It's 25 points to 23, so it's close.
Yeah.
And for the season, I think Tippett has 3 more points than Frost does. Different players, right? But often on the same line. There's not really a big separation between the two. They're the same age. They're both 23.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, Tippett was a really solid junior player. Obviously, a top 10 pick in 2017. He was never a guy who at the junior level scored 40, 50 goals a year, though. And in the AHL level, he was never a 30-goal guy. He has all the tools. He just doesn't yet have the finish. And I this part I agree completely with John Tortorella about, and I'll disagree with him in another aspect. He said that Tippett needs to take the puck to the net more, and I agree. Take the puck hard to the net. He's strong. If you make that sharp cut in from the circle rather than shooting it from a little outside the dot or wherever he ends up shooting from above the circle, take it to the net because he can do that and just play like a power forwards game in there, and that'll also set up more chances from a little higher in the zone because if they have to respect you driving to the net, then they play off you a little bit, and you can shoot a little bit more from the slot. Tippins had a lot of scoring chances this year. Tippins already had enough scoring chances to be a 30 goal guy. Um, I think he'll finish with at least 20, 22. He's at 18 right now, so that's a pretty safe bet. He can do that. Um, but for a guy with all of his tools, I'd like to see actually a little bit more bottom line results. Not that he's not capable of it, but I'd like to see it for more than little stretches at a time, where it's actually paying off. One theme that I've been hearing a lot lately is, oh well, get him a center get him a playmaking center, and you'll see him score. Well, I don't think he gets to those lower slot areas enough where we're seeing a big difference. And B, if you look at the Flyers' scoring chances created numbers this year, outside of Travis Konechny, Morgan Frost is number 2 in the team in chances created this year. So, they to me, I've seen them play their best hockey when they've been together, not apart. I know Torts is a big believer in Tippett. He tends to be pretty critical of Frost in a lot of ways. I don't agree. I'm on a different page than that. But in terms of what Tippett needs to do, I think that I really do. I think that just some small adjustments, and I think he can certainly be a 25-30 guy in his career years. I think there'll be years where he's a little bit up and down in the 20s. I think he'll finish in the low 20s this year. I can't see him not scoring 2 more goals the rest of this year to get to 20. But I don't want to say that he's going to be that upper echelon guy who's going to be a 70-point guy. Not when his career best right now. He's sitting at, I think, 34 points in the season. So if he get to 40 points this season, that'd be nice. And it's the same thing too with Frost, incidentally. Frost, if you over the last 41 games is at a 50-point pace. 50 points to 70 points is a big jump, right?
Yep.
So
absolutely.
So I think both guys are certainly top 9 forwards. Hopefully they take that next bump up to top 6. A big problem with the Flyers guys this season. People go, well, this roster is just atrocious. There's no NHL guys. Well, I disagree with that. I think that they're, particularly when the team was healthy and they're rolling a little bit. I think, well, actually, I look up and down this roster. I think these are NHL players. This isn't. I've seen some versions of Flyers teams like the 06-07 season, where these guys are just not NHL players. I think what you actually have is guys playing a line too high in cases.
Yeah,
they don't have a
That's what we've been saying here on this
podcast. And I think that's the that's how I assess it too. Anyway, but
yeah, I think you're spot on, Bill. Just because I mean, if you look at this season in general, right, when you have guys like a Couturier and Atkinson who are going to play in those top line type of roles, and you get these younger guys kind of taking their positions and taking their spots. They've never really played these types of minutes before, but also they haven't played against this echelon of talent, like first line guys of other teams, right? So when you're placing younger guys like a Frost or a Tippett against those guys, obviously it's going to be a challenge for them to adjust. And I mean, they've done a pretty good job on a lot of nights where they have created chances. Like you're saying, it's just not a lot of scoring found, at least for Tippett, I would say. I mean, all the skills, all the physical tools. You could totally see, I mean, he's even adjusting his game more in kind of the mold that Torch is looking for, kind of trying to drive the net, things like that. It's just, as you alluded to, Bill, a lot of the scoring isn't there. And I mean, you look at the last 5 games, right? He has a ton of shots, over 20 shots, and no goals. And you kind of just see that extra part of his game, and you're wondering, okay, if he can kind of figure it out a little bit and figure out, okay, this is really how I finish at this level at a more consistent rate, then he is going to hit that 30 goal echelon for sure. And I would say, at least for Frost and his season so far too, he's had a big part in, I mean, creating a lot of the scoring chances the Tippets had, and that he hasn't even finished off, right? And imagine if he finishes those off, like the points for both of them together. So I think they're still really young. Like 23 years old is still young in the league, considering the fact that this is really their first season getting a full look, like 82 games. So you never know where they're kind of going to end up getting to. But I would say for sure that 50, 60 points is a range where you can look at and say, okay, you could see those guys probably make it to that point at some stage in their careers, I would say.
Oh, for sure, and that's why I use that 41 game sample.
Yeah,
That's a half. That's a statistical half season.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So and both guys pace out at about 50 points. So so get your read. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, and just to add to what you were saying, I mean, I even think about a guy like Noah Cates. Like, you look at the matchups that he has to deal with. Well, imagine if those matchups were behind Sean Couturier, and then you look at the combination of the defensive centers. Again, I think a lot of people have been overly harsh about this team. It's clear to me why we're at the bottom. I think we need to take advantage of the injuries that we've had, because I think it has slotted this team to look like it is an illusionary bottom of the NHL team when it really is a bubble team that should be suffering in that mediocrity place. But maybe this is a blessing at the end of the day, because we weren't really going to make enough noise to begin with. But I see a guy like Sean Couturier. I think people forget because it's been so long, but he is a high impact player. This is not an average player. I hear him labeled as a second line NHL player. Like, I don't know what people are talking about. This is one of the best two-way centers in the game. He's a guy who's shown he can do a point per game. And if you put him with the right combinations, you look at the season that TK is having, you think about maybe Atkinson or Tippett on the side, like, you can put together a highly competitive line, and then everything else slots a lot nicer. And Frost all of a sudden opens up a little bit more, and Cates opens up a little bit more. These things do have a trickle effect. We talk about Matt Niskanen as if it affected this team so much. Well, Sean Couturier was much better than Matt Niskanen. I love Niskanen. And I just think that's underrated. I think this team needs to take advantage of the fact that Couturier is out. But we need to understand that too. I completely agree with you, Bill.
For sure. I'm hoping, whether he gets in any games this year or not, I'm hoping that obviously Couturier can play and stay healthy finally. Just a sheer stroke of bad luck where the Flyers extended him. Other than a rib injury, which can happen to anybody, he'd been healthy for years. He hadn't missed
that one MCL in the playoffs.
The MCL,
really.
And he played through it.
6 points. Was it 6 points or 5 points?
5 points with a hat trick was crazy performance, but
for sure. Is Couturier Sidney Crosby? No, but
he's a good player. That's for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, he's more Patrice Bergeron, right?
Exactly.
That's really kind of the mold player that he's in. Kopitar, maybe not the pure hands of Kopitar, but that caliber of player, right?
Absolutely.
And that's what healthy Couturier is. Now, how healthy is he going to come back?
That's the question. Who knows, right?
We don't know. We don't know, and that's considering there's 7 more years in that contract at a big cap hit. That's a huge concern. I would like to have, if he can come back. You don't force a player into the lineup if he's not ready. But I'd like to have a little bit of a peace of mind that he's been through a couple games and he's held up through those. So it's a little bit less to worry about in the off season.
I would agree 100%, Bill, on that. Just with Couturier, like, you want to see him obviously get some games in if possible, if he is healthy, because for me, I mean, if you look at it, he's been out since December of last season. It's basically a year and a half. Even he said in the press conference himself, if he doesn't play this season, you're inching up on 2 years of not playing an NHL game. And the game can pass a player by in a quick amount of time, especially if they're not playing that, in that period of time. And also, I mean, it's a very fast game, and he's never been the quickest of foot, and you add the back surgeries in, you never know how it's going to play out. So I just think for him in general, him getting back is probably good, because then he can kind of benchmark and say, well, okay, this is where the game is at, and this is where I'm at. This is what I need to do this offseason to kind of get back to where he wants to be with his own game, I would say.
Yeah, and we could say the same thing to an extent about Cam Atkinson too.
Yep.
Yeah,
of course.
Especially because he's a little bit older. He's getting in his mid-30s. He's a little guy who plays big. Those guys can break down as they get a little bit older. they've missed Atkins in a lot of ways. Just a heart and soul kind of a player. He makes that second and third effort all the time. Is he gonna score? I don't think he's gonna score 40 goals again. Is he gonna score 30 again? I don't know, but I know he can still score 25.
Yeah.
And the Flyers can certainly use every little bit of that they can. Good PK guy, shorthanded scoring threat. Atkinson brings a lot of good things to a lineup. Now the Flyers, what they do not have is they don't have the superstar talent. They just don't. And hopefully whoever they draft this year, maybe not instantly, but over a few years. And if you get Bedard, obviously that's a game changer.
Yeah.
Now, no one's a perfect player. So Bedard and Torch would be an interesting dynamic. Okay, Torch would have to live with.
I think you just let him loose at that point, right? You got to live with the defensive shortcomings a bit.
Which you have to. That's a piece of it, and I think Torch would ultimately live with it, but not after some back and forth.
Oh, of course. It would be a fun thing to cover for sure, just to see it happen there.
It would be a very interesting dynamic. I mean, I'm hoping we get to see it, right? That would be an offensive game changer. That's a guy who can come into the league, average over a point per game as a rookie, and then be a 100-point guy year in and year out.
I was thinking this yesterday, Bill. It's pretty obvious that he is already one of the best players in the world. Yes. Like if he was in the NHL today, he probably would be in the top 15 points. Like that was my thought as a 17-year-old.
Which is nuts, considering his age.
some of these goals that he scores
are insane.
It's insane. It doesn't even look like he has any opening, and he finds it, and he has that. He just, he could be almost at a standstill and then take off too.
Yeah, and he can slow the game down too, and just be so deceptive. Yeah. The guy is just crazy on all levels.
He might be that rare guy, and we mentioned Frost a bunch. Frost could do that in junior hockey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But like so many players, you can't. Doing it in junior hockey and doing it in the NHL are two different things.
You got closed on pretty quick.
Right. It closes real quick. And these are pretty smart players you're playing against now too. So it's a different game. Bedard isn't going to have to adjust to the pace. He already plays the pace. So it would be amazing. I mean, this is actually a really good draft. And one thing, and we could, talk about this again if you guys want one. It's actually close to the draft and you know where they're picking. If the Flyers, let's say they do draft number 5, number 6, right? What if Michkov was there?
I was saying that yesterday.
You have to take him, I would say, just based on talent alone. Even despite the fact that he might not come over for a couple of years, he's probably pure talent. He's probably the number 2 in this draft
for sure. Yeah. For sure. Now it could take as much as 4 years.
It's worth the investment, though. I would say.
Oh yeah, I mean, it would be worth waiting until he's 22, as long as he stays healthy. Yeah. And there's your dynamic. Well, if he might end up being the second best player in this draft. Now Fantilli's a really good talent. Carlson's a really good talent. I mean, there is quite a bit of talent.
There's a lot of forwards in this top 10. Well, we talked about this on a previous episode we had with Steve, who's really great with the draft stuff, the draft analyst, and he was kind of breaking the top 10 down for us and just saying, there's bona fide first-line players pretty much scattered throughout the whole top 10, so you can't go wrong as an NHL team picking in the top 10 this year. So even for, a lot of fans saying, well, the Flyers aren't finishing in the bottom 5, it's kind of the end of the world type thing. Even if they finish with an 8th pick or a 7th pick, like, you still have the chance to get a really impact guy, right? So
the top end of this draft is tremendous. I'd love if they could work something to get us another first round pick, because this is the year where then it becomes more like every other draft. But what's going to happen is guys who would ordinarily go not in the top 3, but within the top 10. And once you get past the consensus top picks, guys, it's kind of unpredictable how a draft will go. So you might get a guy who in an average draft would go top 5 to top 10.
He's going to go 20 or something here.
Exactly.
Or even 20th. Then all of a sudden, hey, you get a pretty darn good player there too.
Mirrors 2003 a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there is a potential there. Um, so I would love to see that, and then it also hurts a little less not to have a second round pick too. So
Yeah.
that's
I was thinking about, I mean, is there opportunity to maybe package both first for next year into this year's
yeah.
draft and be highly aggressive and just say, we're just going to go for this draft. We'll worry about a first round pick next year. We'll try to trade somebody
Well,
else
that's an
off.
interesting idea. You never know. Maybe, I mean, that's a move Briere's looking to kind of get aggressive with. Who knows, right?
And something else, guys. The Flyers might be in position to do because they're not going to be aggressive in free agency this year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have JVR off the books. That's $7 million right there, right? Um, if you trade Hayes, you're going to eat contract for a number of years, but you're not paying assets out. You'll get a pick or something. Then all of a sudden you have a lot of cap space where you could take on some expiring contracts that you don't necessarily want, but they can be stopgap guys. And you've seen what the teams pay for cap space.
Yep.
That's where all of a sudden you can stockpile a bunch of picks and prospects, and just by taking on a bad contract for a year or two. That's
true.
So there's an opportunity there if you can just open up a little bit of space.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting with the Kevin Hayes. I mean, I think he is the most likely to be moved, and I think if we can get any assets and free up cap space, they're going to look to do it. He just, it just makes the most sense with where the team is. So let's transition here into the big news because we didn't really open up with it, even though it's the biggest news to happen in a very long time. So Danny Briere is now officially the interim GM of the Flyers. Obviously, Chuck Fletcher has been relieved of his duties after a tumultuous 4 years. I'll leave it at that. And I want to go through a couple things. Obviously, I want your thoughts on Briere, the interim tag. If you think he's here to stay. My personal thought is yes, and I think they split the role up, and the reason why they did that is because he's more green. So obviously they want to probably bring in somebody more senior as president, and also they realize there's too much pressure on that one role, especially with the public relationships and dealing with corporate and all that. I think a lot of that makes sense to me, but I also want to talk about whether Clark, Holmgren, Lombardi, all these people are actually a problem. I'll just speak for myself here. I don't speak for Vasili, but I don't buy that at all. I think it's a talking point. And I think when people talk about removing people and firing people, they can't even name the people that they're talking about. And I think people are just angry. I think it's ridiculous, the idea of trying to kick out franchise caliber players who have been GMs and brought success. And all of a sudden the story, there's never been success here. All this is nonsense to me. So I do want to talk about that too. And just, what do you think about the transition here? Do you think anything's really going to change wholesale? And I mean, like on the management side, and just, I guess your overall thoughts on that. Sorry if that was a little too long.
No. I mean, it's a great question. It's a fair question. This is how I'll put it. Okay, perception becomes reality, and I can argue from here till the middle of next week that the role of the senior advisors, particularly as pertains to personnel decisions, is not what it's been portrayed as. I could no not I could speak from a little bit of personal experience here. I'm not, and this is not from a hockey ops perspective. This is just from dealing with these guys, from doing work for the Flyers and working for the Flyers alumni. Okay, I've been in meetings with Paul Holmgren. Now it's not hockey operations meetings, but still, I know what Paul's like in meetings, and he's not a guy who talks a lot. He listens a lot. Jots down a few notes, but he does a lot more listening than talking. When it comes time to give his point of view, he never leaves you wondering how he feels about it, and then he drops it. Whatever the group decides, he goes along with. I can testify to that. Unlike I'd say 99.9% of the population, and I'm unbelievably lucky to have gotten to do this. I've sat on a bus with Bill Barber for half an hour or 45 minutes and just talk hockey with him, just kind of picked his brain. Not an interview, just a conversation, right?
Very cool.
I know from Homer and from others that what Bob Clark was like as an advisor, because um, all those guys are available when you want them. They are guys with strong opinions, but they never try to force their way. It has to be my way. Homer is actually pretty happily retired. He likes being with his grandkids, going to the occasional hockey ops meeting, weighing in on different things. Homer and Clarky are not, you know, they're not in lockstep on everything. There are things in hockey they disagree with each other about. And I'll give you an example. I gave this as an example, I think, with Jason Martinez the other day. For example, Clarky is still pretty old school in terms of what kind of defenseman he likes. He likes big physical defensemen, kind of that Darian Hatcher mode. Not that Homer doesn't like those kind of players, but really, he'll talk about how the game has changed, where the puck moving D are so important, and there's a role for the smaller guys too. We had a conversation, pretty long conversation actually after the Flyers drafted Cam York, and he really saw a lot of upside there, and he liked that draft pick. No, he wasn't involved in the scouting. He wasn't, he wasn't at the draft making the pick. When Homer moved from GM to president to senior advisor, he there was a lot of deliberation that went into that each step. So, I don't see it being what people portrayed it as. I don't know Clarky as well. I've interviewed Clarky, say hello to him. If I see him around the building. I do know what people who have been on the hockey side who've worked with him, and certainly guys who were his teammates. As a player, what his leadership style was like. So, having to control everything is just as a GM you have a lot of control, but those guys, Clarky. It's been a long time since Clarky was a GM. Clarky enjoys being on the golf course, enjoys getting a tan. He likes traveling back to Flin Flon a couple times a year, and otherwise being in Florida most of the time. So, Chuck Fletcher was a very collaborative general manager. That's his style. Maybe to his own detriment, but it wasn't that those guys were forced on him. I'm sure Clarky gave him a good recommendation as GM. Clarky hired him in Florida.
Yeah,
that was his first job after actually Fletcher was an agent very briefly, but then and of course everybody knew his dad, and I'll also say about Chuck is that he's a total gentleman, really good guy, and not a dummy. But sometimes I think if anything it kind of worked against him sometimes, where I think that Chuck would look at all the relevant considerations and ponder and think about this and that. Sometimes opportunities might have slipped away. I think that's fair. One thing too, if they're being critical, the pressure and listen, hey, the bottom line is the bottom line, and the criticism is merited. But if you're gonna blame the senior advisors, was Homer the kind of guy who sat in his hands, was afraid to take action,
No.
was slow to take action?
No.
Or Bobby Clark, if anything, too, right?
Those guys, if anything, they may be too aggressive sometimes.
Yeah.
Maybe a little hasty at times.
The moves don't scream Holmgren or Clark to me personally.
No.
I think, with the senior advisor thing in general, like that was perfectly said, Bill, I would say, just all the insight you gave. But the senior advisor stuff, I think, is just a little bit overblown from a lot of people that aren't actually in the rooms or in those conversations to know what's really going on. At the end of the day, what does an advisor do? They advise. So like you're saying, if they're going to be open and available to a guy like Fletcher who wants to talk to them in those situations, I'm sure they probably gave him advice in certain scenarios, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have any decision-making power involved in the ultimate final decision, which they definitely weren't. And I said this on previous episodes, and it's something that I noticed just randomly, actually, but I saw that Bob Clark, he removed himself even from being a member of the board of the Hall of Fame, Hockey Hall of Fame, who actually just sits there, essentially meets like once or twice a year and just picks who goes into the Hall of Fame. So if he's not even willing to kind of be on that board and do that anymore, I'm sure he's not very involved in the active decision makings on a day to day for the Flyers' perspective. At least that's my thoughts, anyway.
Yeah, Clarky likes being mostly retired, and
that's what I mean.
Like even alumni events. Clarky comes once in a while, but it's not like it's not like he's the face of the franchise anymore. And he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be.
Well,
and I know Bill Barber pretty well too. His role in the organization is really more working with Dave Scott in explaining what Hockey Ops does. It's not in telling him what to do. He's not a business.
Right.
So and Billy's not in any of those Hockey Ops meetings. Wasn't involved in hiring Torts. In fact, the only one of the senior advisors who was involved in the interview was Dean Lombardi. And Dean is the guy who gets mentioned the least.
Yeah.
But Dean was more involved in that than any of the other guys. And nobody ever mentions Mike O'Connell either as the senior advisor, because he's a senior advisor on the player development side. But that's a guy who was a former NHL GM, former NHL player. And I think people just go to it's the old guard, blah 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 blah, right? And last thing, people who say you have to hire from the outside.
Yeah.
It can't be anybody with connections with Fire. It just can't be.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
That's just as foolish as only hiring people
you're narrowing your pool, essentially. You got to look at everybody and who's a good candidate. It shouldn't really matter if you're a former Flyer or not. If you fit the candidacy, then sure, right?
And let's go back to the 06-07 disastrous season. Worst season in franchise history. When Bob Clark stepped aside, and Ken Hitchcock, was fired as coach, and John Stevens became the interim head coach, and Homer was the interim GM the rest of that year. The Flyers went really hard after Colin Campbell, and ultimately Campbell decided, hey, I have a good gig going here in NHL.
Yeah.
I think he was still doing discipline at that time for the league, and he still is the head of hockey for the. Thank goodness they didn't hire Colin Campbell, because it would have been a disaster. Right? It worked out pretty well with Homer for most of his tenure. So that was a case where staying inside, where the guy they wanted, and that was a guy with no Flyers connections whatsoever, other than some friends in the organization. That's a case where going outside would not have worked out.
But I'm sorry.
Sometimes the best moves are the moves you don't make. So, in terms of the search for a team president, and it's funny how the names that have been coming up have been, in many cases, like guys with previous connections with the Flyers, like Robert Wish,
Mellenby,
Lindros.
Even Ray Shero to an extent, but it's been like 40 years.
With Ray Shero, like yes, his dad was a legendary coach,
but he doesn't really know. There's no active connections at that point. So
Freddie passed away 33 years ago, and Freddie last had any connection with the Flyers in 1978. That's when he went from the Flyers to the Rangers, and everyone involved in Freddie's hiring, everyone who Freddie worked with, they've all passed away too. So Ray's really made his own way in the game. That I just don't see that. And final point. Everyone would agree that Steve Yzerman has been a really good general manager in the NHL. I don't think that can be disputed. Take a look at Detroit's front office. Take a look at their hockey ops.
It's all ex-players.
It's full of Yzerman's old teammates, friends, and his brother is there too. I mean, up and down their hockey ops, these are the people he surrounds himself with and he trusts. Nobody
Not,
said boo about it
it's not
because he's
Flyers
doing a really good
exclusive
job.
doing
So
this. It's it's an NHL thing. Like even if you look at the Leafs or if you look at the Montreal Canadiens, you look at a ton of teams, it's usually a lot of former guys that are in roles with their former teams, right? And it's a sense of doing good by your former players and alumni in a situation like that. But also these guys are hockey lifers, so they're going to be in those positions and they're looking for those jobs. So why wouldn't you hire a familiar face, right?
Well, yeah, and honestly, I think all those points are excellent. And honestly, I think there's a lot of revisionist forget history. And I'm listening to Hockey Canada, I'm listening to everything, and it's like, oh, the Flyers haven't been competitive for all of a sudden 30 years. There's nobody here. They've never started over. They've never what was the entire hex? I did not forget anything.
Yeah.
I remember the conversations with Snyder, how he was going to take a step back. We were going to rebuild. We did a rebuild. The stock is not completely empty here. Most of the guys here worth building around are in their early 20s. We're not even finished a rebuild. Like, I can understand having a reset, but we hired from the outside. And how does nobody notice that when we fire these guys from the inside, they go to other places and win championships or become successful? Berube, Bill, I remember Braden Shen wasn't worth a bag of pucks. I remember all of this. I remember Dave Haxtell, and I said on this podcast, people said Dave Haxtell was stupid and horrible. And I remember even hearing stuff that G didn't like him. And I'm like, this is absolute nonsense. He was an average coach. He was a young coach. He had some ups, some downs, and we'll see how he does in the future. And boom, better coach today. Go ahead,
like Hack landed on his feet as an assistant in Toronto right away.
Immediately.
Right away. And now he's doing a pretty darn good job in Seattle as the head coach.
And you heard Torts rave about him actually when we played him.
Bro, yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a team that does so much with by committee.
Yep.
They are like the ultimate scoring by committee team because they score a lot of goals. You could see playing them how, my goodness, they're just they hound the puck constantly.
They're so fast too, I would say.
They're very fast. It was like the teams that he had in North Dakota because they were always at the collegiate level, one of the best puck pressure programs and puck possession programs.
Yeah.
They just have the horses here to do it. Hawk is the worst coach I've ever seen, and he got run out of town. And everybody talks to like the group think with the Flyers. Well, did Hexy subscribe to the group think?
No.
He actually
the opposite.
It didn't work out well for him either, technically.
So Hexy's biggest mistakes were I think that the circle around him was a little too small. And you can do that. You can do that if you're winning. It's harder to sustain that if you're not.
Of course, yeah.
And the other piece of that too was ultimately the Flyers had that 98-point season in 2017-18. And they were a little overmatched by the Penguins, but they were still a period away from getting that to a game 7 too.
Yeah.
But still, they had 98 points, and Hexy kind of said internally, "We're ready to take the next step now. I'm not going to win the cup yet, but we're ready to take the next step." And that's where the JVR signing came from.
Yep.
Right, and then they went to the next year with an injured Brian Elliott and an injured Michael Neuvert, and that's who ended up with that goalie carousel.
Collapses from there pretty much.
They brought Pickard in, and that didn't work out at all.
8 goalies.
That's what ended his tenure here. I mean,
yeah,
and so you add that he didn't have a lot of allies. One thing that I think was a lesson for him is that you need allies in management, including your president, your team president.
100%.
So that was definitely a learning thing. But anyway, people, they talk about team culture and tradition and whatever. Everybody has their own ideas, and so you go from there. But no, that's exactly right. That there's guys who leave and all of a sudden they're winning cups or can at least contending elsewhere, and then it's like point to the next scapegoat. I think that
right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I
The
mean,
scapegoat.
honestly, I think part of the reason why Bob Clark got a little bit more involved again was his loyalty to Chuck Fletcher because they're close and he's close to the family. I don't know how much involvement he even wants.
Yeah.
So if it becomes, because don't forget, Clarky held largely a ceremonial title before anyway. He'd be fine going back to that. You know, I honestly, I mean, I think Homer's level of involvement now is fine, and
Yeah.
certainly in the alumni side, he does so many good things with the alumni and the community side that just stay behind the scenes because he doesn't want publicity for it.
Yep.
But you
Do
know,
you do
I want
you
to keep it around some capacity, and Bill Barber too. I mean, Bill Barber. You know, people when they talk about Billy's career, they forget that he was the Tampa Bay director of player personnel, a pretty important role when they won their cup under Torts in 2003 or 4.
Yeah.
Billy helped shape that roster along with Jay Feaster. So, you know, uh, considering that and that he won the Calder Cup as a Phantoms coach and 2 Stanley Cups as a player and the Jack Adams Awards as an NHL
what does
coach.
he know, right?
Anyway, what does he
What does
know?
he know?
Yeah.
When I hear people and Bill, I listen to every podcast. When I hear people call these guys idiots, I'm not gonna lie, it makes my stomach curdle. I'm like, this is the exact opposite. This is not how you want to run an organization. You do not run these people out of town. You don't go, oh, you guys are the problem. You make adjustments. You iterate, right? And so let's go back to Briere here. He's got pretty much not much that he can do right over the span here, but I do anticipate they gave him this with the hesitation that he's green, he's never done it, but I think they want him to have this role. And are kind of just leaving it out there that, hey, maybe we might have to replace him. Maybe we move him to president if we don't want him to look over the play. But I think that's really what they want, and they want to bring in that senior guy. Obviously, I've heard, we brought up the names earlier. The one guy that sticks out to me personally, I don't know all of them personally. Like, I don't know their personalities. The one guy I do know personality-wise is Chris Pronger. And as far as I see, a very tough coach, right? Yeah. There's nobody who intimidates Chris Pronger. The guy is extremely sharp. He's not scared of the media. He knows what he's talking about. And he definitely brings the energy that we would need top down for the discipline, for the winning attitude, the lack of excuses, and the protect your team at all costs type of attitude, which I've seen him do, right? Stealing the puck in the Stanley Cup Finals, right? Like, focus on me. Don't worry about Briere, right? Like, he can do that. Where I don't think Dave Scott could do that for Fletcher. I don't think anybody could do that for Fletcher. I think this is why his dynamic works. But what do you think about somebody like Pronger? And, do you have a preference overall?
Yeah, I mean, well, Pronger is an intriguing name. He has a little bit of management experience, not a ton. That's the risk in there. That if it's if it's Prongs and Danny, then it's an inexperienced GM and
Yep.
a guy who's again he has a little bit of management experience. I know people have wondered, does he even want to step out of like his real estate thing and whatever. I think he would do that. Guys kind of itch to get back in the game in some capacity. Chris has talked several times about how his biggest regret here was unfinished business. So
I love that.
So I think that even though there's relative inexperience, I think that might work. I've heard Eric Lindros's name out there. I can't see that at all.
One, I don't get that.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. We kind of said Lindros doesn't make a lot of sense just because he doesn't have much experience in a managerial role. So then you have 2 guys that are super green. I think for Pronger, like you were saying, Yariv, and you as well, Bill, he just seems like a guy that's not going to be intimidated and somebody that kind of exudes the way you want your organization to run in a top-down manner. So in terms of that, it'd be good. Obviously, inexperience there as well. But sometimes inexperience isn't a bad thing. You get 2 guys that are creative in the front office, and they can kind of make some good moves. So it could be a good thing for just some fresh eyes there with Pronger and Briere, obviously. And I think, Shiro is a guy too that's probably a candidate and a real serious one, just because he's won a cup with the Penguins. He pretty much, if you look at New Jersey and their rebuild, he's had a major impact there, despite the fact he's not with them anymore. So if you look at it from that perspective, and they do want to go with a more experienced guy over Briere, I think he probably makes the most sense. And then you have Olchuk as well. That was kind of rumored in there, but I don't know how realistic that would be, really.
And the other name that's out there, which is interesting, is Robert Ashe.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that one as well.
Now, Chico's done it, with the AHL level,
Yeah.
but the Utica franchise was on the verge of oblivion. They were you know, all but gonna fold, move, etc. He saved that franchise. I mean, Utica's actually a great success story in the American League. That was different than doing it in
It's a big
Utica.
deal. That's a big deal, Bill.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that is an intriguing name, and he and Danny are friends. That plays into it.
I think that's a great point. And a guy who has a history of coming into a situation where things aren't great
Yeah.
and, living through that and coming in. And again, another ex-Flyer. But, it's interesting, though, because Robert Esch was a good player. He was never a great player, right? He had his moments. He was a good player. But I do find a lot of times it's those guys who are like just pretty good or average players that a lot of times are the best hockey minds.
Yeah.
So maybe to your point, it's like we focus so much on these stars and these big names, but a guy like Robert Esch might be the right man for the job.
And mega competitive.
Yeah, which is what I love about Briere. Is ultra competitive, and that's what I think we need.
For sure. I mean, I after a loss, Danny was always dejected after a loss. I mean, he took it personally, and as great of a guy, and Danny really is a great guy away from the ring. The situation with his son right now is really, that's wrong. But it doesn't reflect on Danny as a person. Danny's a great guy. But Danny the person versus Danny the hockey player. Danny the hockey player had a pretty good mean streak about him.
A little nasty in the corner.
Oh yeah, for sure. And sometimes guys would go after him and they'd be sprawled on the ice, and he gave him a good two-hander behind the leg. He knew how to make space for himself. I like that competitive drive. He's going to be competitive, and while a lot of this is learning on the job, and there will be missteps because it's just inevitable. Nobody's perfect, and some of it comes from experience. But but he has the work ethic and he has the competitiveness. I think to have a highly competitive team president, it's a good mix with that. And I think that's also two guys why he's carrying the interim tag for now, because part of the whole messaging here is they're going to review everybody's job.
Mm-hmm.
Although Danny's essentially said Brent Flair is going to stay on, but he almost has to say that because it's really late in this process to
switch.
You're basically it's too late in the draft cycle to change out your amateur scouts and to change out your AGM. I would not be surprised if there were changes over the summer in the pro scouting department. There are a lot of very senior scouts there. I'm not going to name names, but a lot of those guys have been there for a long time, and all good guys and all good hockey people. But sometimes change is a good thing, and I wouldn't be surprised if after the team president is in place, then you start seeing some of those roles in on the pro scouting side, maybe a spot or two in the amateur side, on the development side, and whose name kind of slips under the radar. And by the way, was an outside guy. Alan McCauley, who's the Flyers director of player personnel. I've had the privilege of talking with Alan a few times. Really bright guy. Seems to understand today's game and what's involved in bringing players along. You don't hear his name a lot out there, but he's internally in a pretty important position. Well, what's his future in the organization? He'd been a scout for a number of years after his playing days, but he's pretty new to the management side. So, does Alan stay aboard? If so, what's his role? I think Brent will stay on for at least, certainly beyond this draft cycle, at least in a year or two, and then see how it goes with him and Danny.
Yeah.
But there could be, I think there's going to be a lot more changes coming, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That I think, and who even knows? I mean, will the Flyers bring back the entire same staff of assistant coaches for next year? Yeah, they may. Certainly, Brad Shaw and is tightly connected with John Tortorella. Everybody likes and respects Rocky Thompson, but but if you go through the end of the season, you haven't shown
Yeah,
improvement.
if the results aren't there, sometimes you got to make a change, right?
There's always the possibility that there might be changes. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go on to, we got two more topics here. I don't want to stretch you on too long here, but this is the one big one. I want to make sure we don't skim over this one. Then I want to end with kind of phantoms and young guy talk. The Carter Hart rumors coming out of Canada, the Jeff Merrick word. Now, Carter Hart's name's been thrown out there as Flyers could potentially be shopping him. Look, this is my personal opinion on this. I think Hockey Canada would love to have Carter Hart, and that's why I think rumors with him would start spurling. I think it's extremely unlikely that he gets moved. At 24 years old, you might as well be a rookie as a goalie. You're really at the beginning of your career. I think people are jumping ahead of the fact that he wants to leave and they're going to lose him. They have plenty of protection and time over him. They also have young goalies who have not proven behind him, including Kolosov. We didn't even get Fedotov here. I don't see that Danny Briere would also make a decision like this within 24 hours and that it would publicly make it out. So I know it's kind of caused a lot of panic amongst people and a lot of people kind of jumping rah-rah for it. This is my opinion, Bill, and I know Vasili kind of pretty much agrees with me, at least on most of this, is I really don't see guys in their mid-20s moving. Maybe one of them, maybe a Provorov, right? Like maybe a Sanheim, maybe one of these big contracts potentially. But for the most part, I expect the Flyers to keep these guys in their early mid-20s and build around them. The older guys, right? The guys who are around 30, maybe even a guy like Risto, maybe even a guy like D'Angelo, who's a little, in that mid-range, but obviously has a tradable contract. Like, these are the type of guys I expect to get shipped out of town, especially in the immediate. But the Carter Hart stuff, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all, personally. What do you hear, or what do you think when you hear stuff like this?
Well, I think the Flyers have to listen. Yeah, that doesn't mean you make the move. It has to be the right move for you. You have to evaluate what is our realistic timetable here. Are we a playoff team in 2 years, 3 years? Is it going to take beyond that? It's kind of hard to project, right? If this is going to be a large scale, where you're gutting things essentially, other than players who are currently 24 and younger, then you're Carter, as you said, he's still just 24 years old. I don't see it happening, but unless somebody blows them away, or there's some package deal somewhere where you're going to get some key piece elsewhere, and you go, well, we have some good prospects. We'll roll the dice a little bit there, but I don't see that being the route that they go. That's just you have to listen. Another fascinating there is Konechny. They don't want to deal Konechny, but again, you have to listen. And
right, if you offer me a top 5 pick in the NHL draft, of course I'm going to trade you Konechny,
yeah,
right?
Right. Yeah. So you have to hear what the offers are, and what and with a name like Konechny, you'd have multiple teams bidding. A lot of teams would be interested. He's not making an outrageous cap hit, etc. So yeah, like Sanheim, there's a little bit of a not a rush to trade, but a rush to make a decision on, because his no trade and his extension kicked in on July 1st. So they have to decide, okay, are we committed to this through what was it's been just a really disappointing year for Travis? Or do we just say, oh, you know what? He'll work through it. We saw him the year before. He'll be fine. Even if he's not a number one guy, he still is a decent top 3. So that'd be the first decision they have to make. Obviously, there's a Provorov decision to make, but I think they'll be talking about a lot of guys, but I don't know how many will actually move other than the guys that you mentioned. You mentioned D'Angelo. This contract has 1 year left, and so I could easily see D'Angelo moving by the deadline next year at the latest.
Yeah, same. I could see an off-season trade for him personally.
Yeah. I mean, there's different ways they could take it, but yeah, I think you have to listen on all possibilities. It's still not the easiest league to trade in, but I don't see the Flyers coming back with 12 new players next season. There'll be changes. but I think the changes will be more gradual than some people are saying.
I think
Yeah,
that's a great way to put it, Bill. I just wanted to chime in, guys. Like, if you kind of look at, what's going on with Briere in the press conference, obviously he said it's not going to be a fire sale. He's not looking to trade, every single player, things like that. So I think you got to take that into account. And then in terms of the Carter Hart stuff, I mean, me and Yariv were talking about it off the air before you joined in, Bill, but same kind of sentiments that we were saying, right? Obviously, you're going to listen to every deal just in the predicament that your team is in, because why wouldn't you, right? If an offer comes your way that makes a ton of sense and you're getting the value you want as a team for a really, good piece, and you're getting like a top, player back that can help you in a different area where maybe you're lacking, sure, you're going to listen and maybe take it into consideration. So why wouldn't they, right? But I think, like you were kind of saying, unless somebody blows them away for a 24-year-old starting goalie, I don't really see them moving him, especially when you look and take into account that the Flyers haven't really had a goalie of his caliber for the last 20 years. So when you look at it that way, even though you have prospects in the system behind him, it's not like they've really proven themselves yet. And with goalies, we kind of know how it goes. Just because a goalie looks good this season for 10 games, it doesn't mean he's going to be really good next season for the same amount or even a more increased role. So you gotta be really careful, right? If you're going to trade a guy like Hart who's 24, and we see goalies in the league, usually they don't come in till around this age, and a good goalie could stay pretty good till they're about 30 to 33 years old and be a really competitive top of the league type of goalie. Obviously, you don't know how long this is going to take in terms of a rebuild, things like that. But I just think it's kind of to say that, oh, they're going to trade him for sure or something like that. I just don't see it like you guys are saying. In terms of the other guys, I think there's definitely will be movement, but I would be surprised to see like the full group of, Provorov, Sanheim, Konechny all traded together, maybe one out of the three, I would say, and then probably older guys like a Hayes or other expiring deals or guys that are close to probably expiring. But for the Hart stuff, I just think that they probably hang on to him versus trade him. That's probably the more likely route.
And yeah, just to add something onto that, and then I'll let you chime in there, Bill. The rebuild statement, I feel like this is a little bit of semantics, because I feel like in the questioning, and Charlie does a good job questioning. So, and he asks a lot of tough questions too. But I noticed that people really want to hear this term rebuild. To me personally, it means absolutely nothing. Retool means nothing to me. Rebuild means nothing. None of these mean anything to me. There is only a process, and you have to go through the process depending on where you are, and that's it. So, like when I heard him say rebuild but not a fire sale, he's almost telling you, guys, I'll say rebuild all you want, but the reality is that I'm not axing this team. That's how I interpreted it, is that there are good pieces here. You might not see all of that. It might not be evident, but there are things to build on here, and they tend to be in their early 20s, mid 20s. And look, I don't know how long this will take, but to assume that it will take forever is also not the right attitude. You don't know if it'll take 2 years. You don't know if it'll take 6 years, take 10, but I know that a lot of teams who have tanked have never gotten out of it, and I have yet to see those teams get out of it. So I don't see the Flyers flushing everybody out of here and starting over. I think they're going to add and hopefully not just get lucky, but be aggressive and try to make a big impact move somewhere along the road here, maybe 1, 2, in the early goings. But that's how I kind of see it, Bill.
No, I agree, and there's really no one team's model that's right for every other team anyway. Right. People point to the New York Rangers. Well, the Rangers had the benefit of Panarin only wanted to play in the New York market.
It was a 1-year rebuild.
Yeah. Adam Fox only wanted to play in the New York market. He's from there, and he handpicked them. Imagine the Rangers didn't have guys like that, and they tore everything down, and all of this was built around Lafreniere and Kakko. Where would the Rangers be right now?
Oh my God!
Those be where they are. That's for sure.
They're coming along slowly, right?
Yeah.
And Lafreniere was, pretty much supposed to be a can't miss all-star player. Maybe certainly not a generational player, but as a first line center, ready for the NHL immediately, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he's finding his way. I think he's going to be a very good player.
Mm-hmm.
But if that had been the crux of their rebuild and what the main pieces, why the Rangers would turn around, they'd be where the Flyers are. Colorado, they say, well, build the way Colorado did. Flyers might not have a choice but to do that, but
That's kind of
Colorado's
what they're doing, right? It's a rehashing of a rebuild that kind of failed midway.
exactly, yeah, exactly, Yariv, because Colorado started the rebuild in 2008, and Matt Duchene was supposed to be the franchise player for them, and they went and Duchene was a good player, but the rebuild wasn't getting very far. They drafted other guys, and just said, it didn't work out, and they had to take a step back to take steps forward. But even then, so they get Landeskog second overall, 2012. They get McKinnon first overall, in 2013. They get Rantanen 10th overall in 2015. All the while here, other than one kind of out of the blue season. Remember Patrick Waugh was coach. They had 1 year out of the blue that suddenly, and then it didn't last. It was a 1 year thing. Then they were just back at the bottom again. A little like the Flyers 2010, their 2020 season, honestly, where it was an illusion for 1 year. But so between the time they drafted McKinnon and then they get Makar in 2017, and then they finally win the cup 5 years after that, right? So that's a very, very, very long process. I mean, I'm hoping this whole thing between Hexy and the Hexy starting it, and whatever steps Danny takes here on out, it doesn't take another 6-7 years. It might, you have to be prepared for that as a possibility.
Sure.
And you also have to be prepared for this possibility. Ours is not the most patient of fan bases, and if they're 3 years in with Danny and they're still struggling, he might start the process. Someone else might be the guy who finishes it.
Sure.
That's the nature of the beast.
Sure.
And have to be prepared for all those possibilities.
Of course.
And you were talking about rebuilds. Well, has Connor McDavid been everything he was hyped to be?
Incredible.
Right? Has Draisaitl been more than he was hyped to be?
Phenomenal.
And yet there's no guarantees Edmonton's going to win a cup. And that, right? Look at Toronto. Toronto, partially because of the division they're in, the last time Toronto got out of the first round was 2004.
Yeah.
And this year playing Tampa, I actually think they could take out Tampa this year. I think they're playing better hockey than Tampa's, but you never know in a playoff series.
Yeah.
And does Toronto get 2 rounds in? I mean, Toronto hasn't been to the finals since '67.
It's tough for the Leafs. I feel like if they lose probably this season, they might clean house a bit in the front office. But when you take on Tampa and Vasilevsky, who knows what's going to happen for them?
Right. And then they run into Boston.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a team people underestimated, and I like to use them as an example of a team that nobody saw this coming this year. I remember when they lost their D a few years ago, and a bunch of guys left the team, and they had people like Grizzly. Nobody knew these guys could take over, and yet they continue to roll out. They have aging players. They have a good system, a good core. Even what happened with Minnesota when Guerin took over. Nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen. That's why I don't like that. It's like, okay, we can say it's going to be a several-year process. We just don't know. We really don't know. And quite frankly, the biggest X factor is this draft. And, God willing, they get Connor Bedard. That does change everything. And if Couturier is healthy, all of a sudden you have a 1-2 punch of Bedard and Couturier. That's a very different conversation than if you don't have Bedard and you don't have Couturier. Then all of a sudden you're like, maybe you are looking at something a little more extensive, right? It's like there's too many question marks.
There's so many X factors that potentially could occur or not, right? You got to kind of let it actually happen and unfold before you come to the conclusion and say, well, okay, 6 years from now, the Flyers are going to be good,
Yeah. So let's end on this. Want to get your final thoughts here on the Phantoms. They did lose 5-3, unfortunately, here, but Cooper Marudi with Garrett Wilson with a hat trick and Cooper Marudi with another 3-point night. The guy is just on fire. Former Flyers third-round pick. I believe it was third or fifth round pick. I forget. You'll correct me. So I want your thoughts on the Phantoms in the playoffs, and then also whether you think Emile Andre is going to be joining them soon. And I believe there's a rumor from San Filippo that the signing is imminent there. And then that Cutter Gauthier, do you expect that maybe he might come over to play, or if he's going to start the season.
Well, we'll do them in quick hit order here. With the Phantoms, you have to finish in the top 6 in division to make the postseason. Even losing tonight, they're in good shape. I think they'll get in. Great experience for young players. One of the best things going on with the Phantoms this year has been that it hasn't been, it hasn't been the O'Reillys and the longtime AHL veterans who've been the biggest pieces. They've had a lot of young players step up this year, so that's been a big thing, and it'll be great experience for them. Great experience for Sam Emerson to play in a playoff. So that's all positive. See Bobby Brink continue to come back from the hip surgery, all those kind of things, because even though he's put up some points, he's not back to where he was yet, and you don't expect him to be. That surgery was a pretty tricky one.
It's a tough injury for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It could take a whole year. So hope next year will be a better indicator on him. Emil Andrea, it sounds like he might just sign the amateur tryout the rest of the season for the Phantoms. I think there's a little bit of a hold on entry level deals because you have an interim GM and no team president yet. That's part of it. I think that as these things fall in place, he'll be one of the guys they sign this summer. I know that they've talked to him about him coming over for next season. I think that the amateur tryout deal for the rest of the season is just a precursor to an entry level deal. So I do think he'll get in some games for the Phantoms late this season and be a rookie for them next year. Pretty exciting player. He's very small, but there's a lot to like about him as a defenseman and as a power play guy too, and as a competitor as well. I mean, as small as he is, I'm not saying he's going to be Kimmo Timonen. All I'm saying is that he's a little guy who doesn't play like a little guy. Nothing intimidates him, so that's a good thing. Cutter Gauthier, I think the organization's preference is one more year of college at BC. Now, if Cutter says I'm ready now and I want to come out now, I don't think they're going to stop him. They'll sign him. But I think that because remember the long-term plan with him is to develop him as a center. Now, if you get Bedard or even Fantilli, maybe that changes that and he goes back. The plan is wing long-term. Who knows? But but I think that decision has yet to be made. I wouldn't be surprised to see him play one more year of college. Was there one more thing that I didn't touch on?
No, that's pretty much it. That was everything. And I agree with you. Do you think Andrea? Do you think he has a chance to play like top 4 for the Phantoms when he joins?
Yeah, at the AHL level, I expect him to get a lot of minutes pretty quickly. It can be hard for a defenseman that small. There are the Torrey Krug comparisons that are out there. That's not a bad comparison for him. He's kind of built along the same lines as Kimmo though. Kimmo was small but with a low center of gravity and deceptively strong. Andreas kind of in that mode. So again, I'm not saying he's going to be Kimmo. I'm just saying that there's precedent for really small defensemen to have some success. So he'll be a fun guy to track. And it wasn't for nothing that he was the captain of Team Sweden at World Juniors.
Yeah, I think several times. Vasili, anything to add here at the end?
No, not too much. Just on Andre. I mean, it's interesting for sure. Obviously, he's playing, in a pro league in Sweden in the top tier, and he's doing pretty well. Obviously, on a team that's not the greatest, but they've been getting better the years that he's kind of been on the team there. So I think it'll be interesting to see how he adapts to the NHL level. As kind of Bill was saying, I mean, offensive minded, but also strong for his size. I think just because he's been playing kind of at that pro Swedish level, there might be less of an adjustment period for him to kind of come over. Obviously, North American ice kind of changes things, but maybe you could see him in the NHL a little quicker than maybe people assume, right?
Let's hope.
Yeah.
All right. This was a great episode. Bill, thank you again. Vasili, thank you as always. Thank you again for coming on, Bill. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please like, subscribe, share. Please go and rate us on Spotify and on iTunes. It's a humongous help for us. Be excited about changes because we're excited about them. And remember, always stay